Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. If you're enjoying this conversation, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on future discussions. Today we have a fascinating guest, Sunila Mubayi. For Suneela, translation is more than language. It's a way of living between identities, histories, and geographies. As a genderqueer, mixed-race translator, and scholar, Suneela's work explores themes of queerness, exile, and the politics of language. Their transitions and essays have appeared in publications such as New England Review, Words Without Borders, and Mada Masr. Engaging deeply with questions of linguistic gatekeeping, identity, and creative freedom, Sunila has translated the works of Palestinian writer Rajeev Batish, whose exploration of queerness and displacement resonates with their own engagement with language as a space of both belonging and estrangement. Their work pushes against the boundaries of language, translation, and identity, making them a vital voice in contemporary literary conversations. In this conversation, we explore translation as queering, as unsettling, as resistance. How does translation reshape literary politics? How do language and identity inform each other? And what does it mean to be a translator who's never fully at home in any one place? Suneela, before we dive in, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Glad to have you here. Been
Super
looking forward to
excited.
this. Yeah, exactly. Been looking forward to this conversation. Let's begin with your thoughts on translation as both practice and a way of being. You described translation as both a way to avoid writing and a space where you feel free. What does translation mean to you, not just as a practice, but as a way of being?
Well, thanks. First of all, thanks so much for having me. I'm quite honored. I think this is the first podcast I do where I am like participate. I'm the only exclusively participating. So I'm flattered.
Yeah.
I have a bad habit of like the things that I write. I often just tend to forget completely what I wrote the moment it's published. But
Yeah.
I would say that for me, translation is, I think it's how we exist all the time. I mean, whenever we speak, whenever we act, we are translating our impulses, and we're not just translating, we're interpreting, we're filtering in real time. I mean, all language in a way is translation of your brain waves, of your emotions, of your body chemistry, of so many things. So for me, like, to work between different languages is, I think, is an extension of that. I don't know if that sounds a bit like airy fairy or what. That's thinking about it. That's how I feel. It's just that I maybe wouldn't have realized it had I not ended up becoming a translator. But having become a translator, it's just, I feel like I realize like how much we are all like translating for ourselves and for others all the time. I don't know, I can't speak for people who live, who spend like long periods in solitude, what it's like for them. But, in this sort of electronic virtual age, even a lot of those people have to interact in some way or the other with others. So I think that human interaction is all human interaction in some way or the other involves translation.
So I want to build on that. Walter Benjamin describes translation as a mode of existence. You describe it as a maqam, a disposition or a state of being. There's an ontological component to that. How do you personally experience translation as a way of navigating the world?
Well, I like what Walter Benjamin said in terms of the maqam. It's so in Arabic music, music theory, the maqam is kind of similar to the rag in South Asian music, where
Mhm.
it's kind of a loose template of melody or notation within which you have a lot of freedom and a lot of challenge to work. And so I think that's how, for me, that's how I experience translation. And it also depends in which, whether I'm doing it into English or out of English. Um,
Mhm.
and sorry, what was the end part of your question? I was just riffing on kind of what being translation as maqam means.
How do you personally experience translation as a way of navigating the world?
Well, it is the main way at the moment that I make a living, but I also very much enjoy translation. Sometimes it feels like very mundane kind of work, almost like, putting bricks together. And it's not so much this kind of artistic, creative impulse, but then maybe a lot of, what is artistic, creative work is like that also, that, only 5% of it are those like flashes or whatever that you have where you feel like you're in some other kind of modus or state of mind. But, as someone who uses more than one language daily, I'm not talking just about my translation work, that too is a kind of existence of translation for me.
You've written that being non-binary and mixed race makes you a more sensitive translator because you exist between different identities. How do queerness and translation overlap for you?
Well, I would say definitely transness and translation overlap for me. And it's not just to make like a, kind of dad joke pun, but I do think that, and this is not, there's many amazing, all the amazing translators, so many are, it's not about that if you are non-binary or trans, you will be necessarily a good translator. But I do think in my experience that part of my personal experience or development is not, it's not a coincidence perhaps that translation is what I ended up going into. I do think for me there is a connection, and I think especially as someone who's kind of non-binary and who's not, kind of a, I would say, just a sort of a, like male to female transsexual. I've always had this sort of indecision and ambivalence about my identity, but I also think that it has kind of made me more receptive and sensitive to the logics of the other languages that I have managed to acquire, where I feel more easily at ease or at home, and they do not feel as foreign to me as maybe they would to others. I don't want to speak for others, of course, but I do think that my sort of, being in a sort of liminal zone in terms of my own identity. I mean, this is, of
Mhm.
course, other than just, being a mixed race kid, growing up bilingual to some extent. But I do think that in my case, it has kind of opened me up and a kind of made me like very easy for me to absorb other languages, let's say.
Unlike English, Arabic has grammatical gender in all verbs, nouns, and adjectives. And Arabic is a deeply gendered language, even in its verbs. How do you navigate gender when translating? Do you see translation as a way of queering language?
For sure. The people I got asked this question in the past also, where someone was like, this is such a intensely gendered sort of binary language, but at the same time, I do think that the intricacy has kind of opens up for a lot of play with these rules. And there's also some like interesting kind of variations or exceptions to the rule that, for example, in Arabic, the non-human plural is treated as grammatically as the female singular. I find that quite interesting, and it's a conventional thing. And sometimes, especially in speech, people break it or they mess with it. So I think it's just in general like there's a sort of opportunity for play, one could say.
Excellent. Queer and diasporic communities often develop coded language to express identity and desire. Have you noticed any kind of linguistic subversion in Arabic literary traditions?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the portrayal of queer desire or queer, identity, and we don't want to be anachronistic and impose labels onto completely different contexts and
Hmm.
time periods, but certainly, one could say non-heterosexual practice or desire is present in the Arabic literary heritage from a long, long time ago. But so sorry, what was the rest of what was you were asking?
I was asking whether queer and diasporic communities often develop coded
Yes.
languages.
Yes. So I recently took part in this publication called the Queer Arab Glossary, which is the project is the brainchild of Marwan Kaboud, who's a Lebanese graphic artist based in London.
Hmm.
And he has a page on Instagram called Takwir, which is like the verb form of queering. It's kind of made up, but it also in classical Arabic it means to like curve something and make it like into a ball. And it's also the
Hmm.
name of one of the surahs in the Quran, one of the short ones at the end, that the ones that describe in detail what, like, the day of reckoning will be like, and so on. But anyway, he on this page, he at some point he started asking people to send any slang that they use in Arabic from whatever region in their daily life when it's really in relation to queerness, and managed to get over like 350 terms. And I worked with him in sort of making these terms in both Arabic and English into making these terms kind of like dictionary entries. um and the book just came out a few months ago. You guys can find it. It's published by Saki Books, which is a bilingual Arabic English publisher in London. That has published a lot of feminist and erotic and queer books in both languages. So to some extent, that would answer your question a little bit, where it doesn't claim to be complete in any sense, to any extent, but it does give and the important thing was also to include like whatever sort of slang came our way, and not only like the politically correct slang. So a lot of it is like offensive, or like demeaning terms, but it's important that these be put in a sort of context where like this is part of the language. um and some of those terms are like like coded ways of people referring to each other, and some are very like
You're,
direct.
yeah. So I want to transition into Arabic and South Asian crossings.
Hmm.
Your father's Kashmiri heritage was disrupted by partition, cutting off his ability to fully access certain linguistic traditions. How did this personal history shape your relationship with language?
That's a really good question. I had a complex sort of I had a little bit of a complicated upbringing because of family circumstances to do with my own parents and my mom, and I couldn't grow up with them. Um, my dad, uh, my dad is of Kashmiri origin, although he never lived in Kashmir. He was born in Lahore, and then migrated after the partition with my grandma, his mother, and his two siblings. But Urdu was definitely their mother tongue, and I can see how for my family who's remained in India and the younger generation, Urdu is not their mother tongue anymore. It's been kind of marginalized and ghettoized in India, and
Mhm.
so I think my dad, after he emigrated, taught himself or retaught himself Urdu to some extent as a way of reconnecting to that heritage and not just losing it completely. So he has an incredible amount of fairs and ghalib memorized. Um, but I think for me, the sort of by accident kind of ending up getting into Arabic was also a way of for me of reconnecting to that heritage, because I only very sort of superficially learned the script, the Urdu script as a kid. We never had it in school in India. But after a year or so of Arabic, I found suddenly, lo and behold, I can read Urdu, and that was an amazing experience. Even if I could read it slowly and so on, and it's not some of the orthographic conventions are different. It's a little bit more difficult. But at the same time, once you read it, 95% of the words are familiar or known. And so that was an amazing way for me of reconnecting to my Urdu heritage in a kind of a circular and roundabout way, rather than, the sort of traditional or more logical thing would just have been, okay, let's study Urdu in college. But for some reason, I didn't do that, at least straight away.
In the temple horror of language, you note that your Indian relatives often ask, but why not Persian? What made Arabic feel like the language you wanted to master?
That's a really good question. I think it had, for some reason, just circumstances. I had just moved to New York right after 9/11. I had a kind of very intense introduction to the Palestinian cause, being a student at Columbia at that time. And I think Palestine was kind of the gateway for me, and ended up being why it was Arabic and not Persian or when I was just very lucky to have a couple of really really good teachers in my second and third years there. I did also do Persian for a year while in grad school, and that was also, it was amazing. It was a lovely experience because my Arabic was quite good by then, and uh, having Urdu as a heritage language, I just remember everything in that I would hear or read during the class would kind of feel like it had some vague echo or it made sense, even if I didn't fully understand it.
There has been a strong push for decolonization in academia, but it still centers English as the default language of sorts. How can translation help break this pattern, especially in South-South exchanges?
That's a really good question. My fear is that decolonization can always become the victim of a kind of oppression Olympics identity politics that has to do with kind of the way the whole neoliberal system, the capitalist or neoliberal system, but that also translates to like in the academic and cultural world, kind of all plays us off against each other and makes us kind of compete with each other for the few crumbs, that are tossed to us by recognition. I think like, turf feminism is a great example of that, where, kind of the patriarchy and capitalism, white supremacy, all that kind of makes cis people and trans people like adversaries rather than allies to each other. So, I mean, when it comes to South, I just, it's hard. One can't. English is the dominant sort of language of the world, and it's not like, I mean, it's not like as if you go to France or to Spain or somewhere where English is not that popular. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're decolonial. But I just think I think when it comes to language teaching, language instruction, academia, and so on, I think one can just promote global South languages more because the majority of the world speaks, these languages, and it doesn't have to be Arabic necessarily. And it doesn't, I think the other thing also is, I think most people, non-white people in the humanities and academia end up studying themselves, quote unquote, in some way or the other. I think one can, I don't know exactly, how many. I think it's changing also, but I kind of feel like I tried to go against this trend and not just specialize in something South Asia related, but something by choosing to specialize in Arabic, I choose to, like, in a sense, reopen those direct cultural and literary connections that were there before, English became necessary in order for those two regions to be able to communicate with each other. So I think there can just be, everybody, people in the humanities who are of, global South origins can think about, looking or choosing to an area or a language or a culture that is not necessarily that of their parents. And I think that would be like a really nice sort of first step.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to get into Palestinian literature, resistance, and gatekeeping. And you've translated Rajeev Batish's work, which explores queerness and exile. How did you first encounter his writing, and tell us a bit about him, and what drew you to translating him?
Sure. It's not simply that, because he's a queer writer and I'm queer and non-binary. It's not sort of that straightforward. I had originally, for my PhD, wanted to work on Palestinian writers from 48. So those who are so-called Palestinian citizens of Israel, or the interior Palestinians. And before I started my PhD, I was in Haifa for 6 months doing an internship at a research center. And I was just trying to meet and find some of the writers who I had chanced upon, whose work I found interesting. And he was one of them. And he was the most responsive. And then while I was in grad school, I translated a couple of his stories. As like practice for a class, and then one of them was published, and then I ended up doing some more, and that's kind of, and so we developed like a close relationship since then, where I've worked on his stuff on and off. And he just has a piece that recently came out that I translated in on Mahzin.org, which I'm happy to share with you about, which is a kind of reflection by him on what it means to be a Palestinian author in the sort of stage, like the kind of dystopic, like post-defeat stage of that Palestinians are kind of going through today.
And what I like about his work is that the manner in which he blurs poetry and prose. And can you tell a bit about that? A bit, just about his style and what you found interesting while translating?
I mean, for me, I found the content of his work more interesting than the style, even though I think his style. His last two books have been more like novels without this kind of form, genre shifting, even though the content is still like very is extremely radical, and it's all kind of, it's not, some people may say that he's depoliticizing, or he's not like talking about the occupation directly enough, but I think he's actually like humanizing Palestinians in a way that, and not refusing to let them be sort of just categorized into caricatures or boxes. And he's sort of, I think, challenging the Arabic language readers, many of whom have a sort of set perception of what it means to be Palestinian, and what life in Palestine is, is some kind of nonstop like left-wing action film. And I think he really challenges that, and he uses the queer angle as one of the sort of ins by which to do that. Although his writings have never exclusively been only about queer characters.
Mm-hmm.
But for him,
So,
I did an interview with him in 2016, where he says that Palestinians are a queer people because, they don't, their nation building project is not going to be realized, and they should embrace that rather than, complain about it. And also because they don't have an army, they don't have any kind of father figure,
yeah.
that, especially since Yasser Arafat died, and for him he says that, look at the Arab states around us, like they're all states, and look at what, how they are with their people. Let's why don't we dream of something more queer than a state, and just want to be like everyone else? And that makes some people like very angry, but I think it's also a very fascinating thing. And it's not at
Yeah.
all a call by him to say, oh, stop struggling, stop resisting, and so on. But I think just the framework within which one does that, especially given the total disproportionate sort of ability with which to inflict violence that there is
Mm-hmm.
something very much is like super provocative and worth thinking about for me.
Yeah, Palestinian literature has historically been centered on like national identity, resistance, and exile, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
Mahmoud Darwish or Ghassan Kanafani.
Mm-hmm.
And Batish, as he adds a queer lens to these themes, like
Mm-hmm.
his work around a room in Tel Aviv or the apartment in Passy Street,
Mm-hmm.
challenges that political and literary norm. So you've kind of mentioned this, but how do you see his work fitting into or breaking from the tradition of Palestinian resistance literature?
Well, I think he's not the only one, for sure. There's a bunch of other writers, and some of them have started to come out now. There's Murid Barghouti. I saw Ramallah, who's a little bit. He's like, he just died a couple of years ago. He was in his 70s. Which there's Hussein Barghouti, not related, who wrote this incredible sort of semi-fictional memoir called The Blue Light, which was just translated to English, which is
Hmm.
like this incredible sort of quasi-Sufi kind of work about, he went to do his PhD in Seattle in the US during the first Intifada, and got mixed up with all these like new age spiritual, and it caused an incredible kind of existential crisis for him. Anyway, I don't want to, but there have been these other voices as well. So
Hmm.
he isn't the only one. He's maybe the first one to like really explicitly have the queer angle. But I think his project or his interest is broader than just being like the gay Palestinian writer.
Yeah, yeah, and And much of Palestinian literature has been deeply tied to the question of exile, right?
Mhm.
And as someone who has lived between languages, do you feel a particular resonance with these themes?
I mean, yeah, in some sense, I feel like I've always been an outsider wherever I am. When I was very, very young, I didn't have this kind of, I didn't see myself as an outsider, but as I grew older, it was kind of the people around me that and their gaze that started looking at me as and that made me aware of my kind of, I don't know, questionable or unclear status. And so I've never really felt kind of like I belonged either to completely to either India or the United States. But I think when it coming back to Rajeev Batish, I think obviously he writes fiction in different forms, but he writes about encounters between the Palestinians, living inside their homeland where they are a minority now, and they have to interact with the Israeli milieu around them, and those interactions are complex. They're not one-sided. They're not like of one nature only. They're always problematic, complicated, multidimensional. And I think, again, that for like the Arabic language reader that has a certain, conception of what it is to live inside Palestine as opposed to it just, being this cause, that it's kind of a little bit shocking and uncomfortable for them.
So, you've described translation as a way to avoid writing, yet writing in Arabic gave you freedom from self-censorship, I would argue.
Mhm.
Why do you think Arabic, a language not native to you, offered that liberation?
Um, that's a that's a good question. I don't want to, sound cliched about it at all. I'm not really 100% sure, to be honest. Maybe it's because I felt like, I mean, I'm not. Firstly, I'm not. I don't think I'm the first person, non-native Arabic speaker there is to write something in Arabic. I mean, to some extent, given the fact that with the diglossic nature of Arabic and standard or modern classical Arabic is to some extent a foreign language to everyone, even to the native speakers. I mean, it's not completely separate from the spoken dialect, but just the way that, there's a difference between like formal Hindi and Urdu and the sort of everyday Hindustani. Um, it's even more exacerbated in Arabic. So everybody learns it to some extent, even if they speak the slang version of the same language. I would argue it's a spectrum. So everybody, to some extent, it's a foreign language for everyone, and that kind of levels the playing field, I think. And I think I was just prompted to write about my life experience in Arabic. When it did, it kind of just flowed out in a way that it never had in English. And I think if other people found it more interesting than, I find it.
Yeah. So, just getting back to the question of Palestinian voices and how does the Western literary market shape Palestinian voices who get translated or published?
That's a problem, good and question. And, I think especially since from the last year onwards, I fear that because, there's been like a genocide happening and, when people are dying, Palestinian people have been dying in such in unprecedented numbers, I think, since, the Nakba. And so that, to understandably, to some extent, has made the presence of voices that push people to think a little bit more differently, a little bit more nuanced in a sense, has perhaps pushed those voices more into the margin. Or I fear that it may, because, like, okay, now there is a ceasefire and so on, but, the need of the hour has been kind of so urgent, that people are dying, that, we need to kind of support the resistance. It's kind of a sad sort of version of, support the troops to some extent. I don't know how else to put it, but, I know with this this piece that I just published in Makhzen of Raji's, there was some worry that, this is not the right time for such reflections like this, where, you're kind of challenging the holy cows of, the tenets of Palestinian identity. And he wrote a small afterword, because he had originally written this, it's been a few years now, where he, sort of re-reflected on, the sort of total sort of paralysis you feel as a writer when, there's death, in this magnitude being, live streamed in front of you. Like, for the first time, you kind of feel like, what is the point even of writing anything? So, I guess, my worry is that it's a fact that, I think we've gone beyond the point, of like when Edward Said said Arabic literature is embargoed, and, people are not. I mean, it's true that the English language, especially the American English language reader, like, there's some ridiculously low percentage of books that are read that are translated books, like even from other European, mainstream European, languages. I wouldn't say Arabic is a marginal language at all, but I guess my worry is that the market will only want those, to translate, those Palestinian voices that again offer this kind of very heroic version of the Palestinian experience that, is more about, it's not that it didn't exist, but I don't think that Palestine or the Palestinian struggle is in that place, and that, it will. I was jokingly, with some friends, like, calling it intifada capitalism, where, you will see, there are like certain now restaurants and ventures and so on, that, okay, everybody, it is a capitalist world and so on, but just like, there's been rainbow capitalism. So, I think there is some intifada capitalism going on. I feel like, I worry that the literary market will just, want to kind of fall in line with that, rather than, like, seeing Palestinian writers as writers who should express themselves and express the complexity of the Palestinian experience, and, perhaps open up people. I mean, I was with Raji in this residency for translators in November, and it was wonderful. I was a little bit worried, because, here's someone coming straight from occupied Palestine. Okay, he himself is not, from Gaza, but still, like, he's living the war there and having to live amongst Israelis, and here he is coming in the, to the countryside of upstate New York, and he was worried that it would not, of the dissonance of that. But I think it went wonderfully well, just because I think it was so defying of the expectations of what people thought a Palestinian writer would be, that I think it was an amazing experience, and I wish that, there would be more experience. And that has been always the experience whenever we have done, like, events and readings and talks together.
Yeah, Your work often kind of challenges the idea that queerness is a Western import by recovering its presence in Arabic literature. But South Asian literature also has its own parallel histories, like Sufi, homoerotic
Mhm.
poetry,
Yeah.
Hijra communities, queerness encoded in mythology of sorts.
Yeah.
How do you see the relationship between Arabic and South Asian queer literary traditions?
Well, I see them as, on one spectrum, from the kind of boundaries of West Asia up till the boundaries of China. I do think that to some extent or the other, we belong to a shared tradition that is, connected between Arabic, Turkish, Kurdish, Persian in its different forms, Urdu, Hindi. You find a lot of the same motifs and the same themes. And I don't want to glorify the pre-modern representations of homoerotic desire at all. I mean, some of them, by today's kind of ethical standards would be considered pedophilia or, borderline pedophilia. And there's no point trying to like, paint that in nice, but one can just understand it, you know, in its own context and still appreciate the beauty of the work of the poetry. Yeah, that's an interesting like question. I mean, I think when it comes to like South Asian, depictions of same-sex cultural depictions of same-sex, there's the monotheistic aspect. Sorry, polytheistic aspect that is not there in Arabic or in Persian so much. Although the whole question of, I mean, looking at the pagan practices of pre-Islamic Arabia is also like a whole other fascinating thing that I love reading about. And so-called Jahili poetry, which is the poetry of, it's the earliest Arabic poetry, we supposedly have. It forms like the
Yeah.
backbone of classical Arabic, and it's an incredible like. You feel almost like there's no separation between the speaker and the environment around them, whether it's the flora or the fauna or the weather and so on. And there are some not explicit but implicit like depictions of desire in some of the poems I've read. There's not sort of normative heterosexual desire.
Yeah. So I want to uh, shift into something else a little bit. You mentioned in your translator's notebook that some purists might consider using English phrases in an Arabic text to be rakaka, poor
Mm,
style, right?
mm,
And but you see it as reflective of real speech.
mhm,
That speaks to a broader sense, a broader issue. Who gets to decide what is proper in language?
mhm.
And building upon that, do you see translation as a political act?
Yes and no. I don't think it should always be reduced to being a political act, or rather, I would say we shouldn't only just look at, you know, the politicized or the political aspects of the translation, because that can end up doing, the aesthetic and technical efforts disservice, just as, you know, in the other extreme, like if you only look at the aesthetic or artistic technical aspects of translation without any real like historical, social, political context, that can also be end up doing it a disservice. But yeah, so that's my answer. But what were you asking about in terms of style and policing of style?
Yeah, in your translator's notebook, you sort of, you know, talk about, sort of the slangifying or like rikaka, right? Using English phrases in an Arabic text has been like criticized as being like rikaka or
Mm-hmm.
poor style, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, there's, so just like building on that sort of argument you're making,
But you're asking, like, what's the difference there between Arabic and in the South Asian context?
no, just, in terms of like slangifying
Mm-hmm.
and just sort of, like this criticism that, it may be, what is real speech, right? When
Or
you're
what is
translating.
good speech or good style
Yeah,
or good.
yeah.
I mean, there is a difference just because the difference between the written register and the spoken register is quite wide, even in comparison to, like, you know, Hindi or Urdu with, like, just with spoken Hindustani. So to some extent, it's like people self-regulate or self-police. And I don't think, I think it's, in terms of like resisting being overrun by English or cultural imperialism, like it's definitely good to find, a way to express yourself in Arabic, for example, without having to constantly insert English or French. At the same time, that can also become a reactionary kind of Puritan thing of wanting to, speak a pure language, and that it can have some reactionary, like,
Mm-hmm.
what is it, consequences, like, for example, people, claiming like there's no word in Arabic like gay, so that means that identity, being gay is just a Western imposition, and
Mm-hmm.
or people can also say that as a way of like justifying cultural colonialism or pinkwashing, that they only have derogatory words for queer desire. Look how they don't, you know they deserve like the colonial impulse. But I don't know more. I don't have like a specific kind of one position on it. I mean, I do think that just looking conventionally or historically, like in the South Asian context, it's kind of just more acceptable somehow to have words from English inserted a lot when you're talking or you're writing, as compared to Arabic, where you're more like expected to take
Yeah.
that part out, especially when you're writing, but also when you're like speaking in a more formal context.
Yeah. In your translation of Sorrow in My Heart, you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
slangifying dialogue to capture the real ways people speak. And I think like queerness too has a kind of linguistic code, which is like subversive, coded, playful, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you think like, queerness and this idea of like slangifying language interact in translation, I guess, in your work?
I mean, it depends. I should plug, thanks for mentioning Sorrow in My Heart, because Hilal Shuman, the writer who's a Lebanese writer, who is now based in Toronto, he's also one of the other contemporary writers, really like writing very fearlessly about queer, with queer characters and queer themes. And again, it's only to become like a niche kind of, the one who only writes about queer stuff. But his, like, writing a novel. This novel is about actually a Lebanese German character who was, during the Civil War, was given up or kidnapped from his parents as a very young child or baby, and adopted by German parents. So he's grown up in Germany as a German kid, but knows he's from somewhere else, but doesn't know anything about. And he goes to try and find his biological parents, while also, like, you know questioning his sexuality at the same time. And also in a context of Berlin post the massive arrival of Syrian and refugee and Palestinian refugees from Syria, who end up kind of also being another way that I don't want to give away the whole book. But this was apparently a phenomenon during the Lebanese Civil War, which was, one was obviously there was a lot of kidnapping and forced disappearances, but there were a lot of young kids who were either taken, like kidnapped, or sold by their parents to be adopted by families in Europe. So, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, just in
But
terms.
yeah, so in that novel, like that, a lot of it is told from the point of view of this character who does not speak Arabic, but the narration itself is in Arabic. So he is speaking English and German, but he goes on his first trip to Beirut, and in his interactions with people, so he hears them speaking in this kind of mixed slang of Arabic, English, French, which is quite common in Lebanon. And so that was, I wanted to try and reflect that kind of messy linguistic situation, which is like the total opposite of like pure good style in a way, to the extent that I could. I mean, translation to some extent is always a losing battle, and you have to kind of be okay with that, I think, before you
Also the process of reclaiming sort of certain terms in Arabic, right? Uh, like I don't know.
like luti, which is a Quranic term, but it's also like a derogatory. It's like the same as sodomite, basically.
Yeah. Uh, so just wrapping up the interview, this has been an amazing conversation.
Thank you, and
Just
my
a little bit
pleasure as
about,
well.
yeah, this has been awesome. If you could translate any queer or underappreciated work, something the world does not yet realize it needs, what would it be?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I would necessarily choose a queer work,
Yeah.
but I can definitely, I would like to go to something from classical Arabic, because I think that there's a, I think also because those works were written / composed, if they were oral, if it was poetry, especially at a time when Arabic was a hegemonic language. It was not a sort of language that's struggling against Eurocentrism. It was the kind of because of politics, because of the Islamic conquests and so on. So there's a kind of sense of like in the prose of the writer Al-Jahiz, for example, who's a incredible, like has this incredible sort of breadth of things that he talks about. There's a sort of ease of talking about anything and everything under the sun that is not found so much in contemporary Arabic. Maybe with writers like Raji or Hilal, that's starting to change a little bit, where you don't feel that as much, that there's that kind of defensiveness or that like self-consciousness about portrayal and representation. So I would choose, there's a poet called Wallada bint al-Mustakfi who was, I think, from the Andalusian period, who was like openly bisexual. Obviously, she was, from the royal family at the time, so like extremely like privileged, and also like I think people should stop like idealizing Andalusia to some extent and dreaming about this kind of nostalgia, because yes, it was a very pluralistic society, but it was also very like classist and segregated and divided. But anyway, some of her, she has like some couplets and lines here and there have been translated, but I would definitely like to work on something like that more. I would like to, I think, translate a lot of the poems of some of the pre-modern vagabonds or salik that I worked on for my PhD. Not everything that they have is, has like queer overtones, but some of it does. But I think their existence is kind of queer in and of itself. So if I given the chance, I would definitely like to work on those.
Absolutely. Suneela, this has been a rich conversation. Before we wrap up, is there anything you're currently working on that you'd like to share or anything of that nature?
Well, I have, let me see. Um, Definitely, like just mentioning, since you asked about slang also, like definitely encourage people to check out the Queer Arab Glossary. Also, I would be interested from bilingual readers, Arabic language readers, because half of the book is the glossary, which is bilingual. The other half is essays about the question of Arabic and language and queerness, which is in English. Those might be translated back into Arabic in the future at some point. But I would very much like to know from queers, like, how they receive this work. It's the first time I do work on something like this. But I have been working in tandem with my translation partner in this project, in the project that I'll mention to you, which is a travelogue by a 19th century Syro-Lebanese intellectual, polymath named Ahmed Faris al-Shadiaq, who spent about 20 years in England and France teaching Arabic to the missionaries.
Yeah.
And he had a very fascinating. He also is a very his all his reflections on traveling in the quote unquote West are so unique and irreverent and witty and different from those of people, of his time and also people after him. And so I've been working on that on and off for the last few years with Rana Isa. And a couple of excerpts are published online. You can find them. I can share the links with you later. But that's something that I'm kind of working on and off, that I hope to finish. And the other thing that I'm hoping to make further progress on, that I started a while ago, is a translation of a longish short story by Sadat Hassan Manto into Arabic. So about 10 years ago now, I had translated two of his stories while I was still in grad school directly into Arabic. One was Toba Tek Singh, the very famous, iconic one, and the other one was called Koldo. So I started working on another short story of his, also about the partition, called Moselle, which takes place in Bombay, and the eponymous character is one of the Iraqi Jews of Bombay, who, and it talks about her sort of on-off love relationship with this Sikh guy, and she's sort of depicted as this, kind of slutty, loose woman, but she ends up doing this sort of I don't want to spoil but it's happening during the partition riots. But the fascinating thing for me in the story also is that, in the narrative keeps saying that she keeps saying, explaining or muttering this or that in her Arabi Zuban, in her Arabic language. So like Arabic is kind of meta present there in that story, and that also is, for me, is amazing. That it is a small window into an Arabic speaking presence in Bombay that, it's probably gone now, but that I feel I would love to share with the Arabic language reader. And the story is available in English, of course, as well. So those are the two
Yeah.
things I'm hoping to work on.
No, that's amazing. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and thank you for sharing your insights. I can't wait to see
Sure.
what you do next.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of the Organic Filaments Network. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more deep dives into literature, politics, and the stories that shape us.